Hey, deserving listeners. So recently I've been posting some episodes on empathy. And since it's in my mind as I'm living my life, I will note the way in which people, including clinicians and psychology students, are using the word. What definition are they operating from? And I came across this Reddit thread that really exemplifies how many different usages there are and how people don't define their use. They just say the word empathy as if everyone understands what they mean by it, but everyone doesn't understand what they mean by it. And in this thread, I thought it really exemplified it and also points to the problems that can happen when we don't define these things. There can be misunderstanding or miscommunication or hurt feelings or upsettedness. So let's get into it. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor, and this is the Psychology in Seattle podcast and YouTube channel. So let's get into it. Okay, so before going into it, I should mention that I am recovering from a cold and my head is all stuffed up. So if I sound a little funny or if I have trouble talking sometimes, it's because of that. So this was a post on Reddit, and it was on the Psychology Students subreddit, which I will look at occasionally. A lot of smart, interesting people on that subreddit, Psychology Students. And the person who originally posted this has deleted it, which I'll get into why I think they deleted it. I think it was because there was a backlash. I can't know that, of course. Also, before moving forward, I should say that I never know how to credit people on Reddit. The vast majority of people on Reddit, like 99.9% of people, their handles are anonymous. So I couldn't really credit them anyway. I mean, some people have handles that are famous, but that's pretty rare. Also, I don't know if people want to be called out in that way. So I'm just going to say random Reddit user number 1 or something. But the title is still there of the original post, which is, sadism requires huge amounts of empathy, in my opinion. So this individual posted, sadism requires huge amounts of empathy, in my opinion. And I'm guessing that the poster is a psychology student. Now, is a psychology student a graduate level student, or are they a bachelor's level? Who knows? And of course, anyone can join. So you don't have to be a student necessarily, but this person is saying sadism requires huge amounts of empathy. Now, originally, they had a lot more to say, like a paragraph of description as to why they're saying this, but that's all been deleted. Only the title remains. And from my memory, what this person was saying was, look, if you're a sadist and you take pleasure in harming other people, and I think they also kind of meant psychopathic sadists, because of course just being a sadist doesn't necessarily mean that you lack empathy. They're highly correlated. If you suffer from sadistic personality disorder, there's a high likelihood you also suffer from antisocial or psychopathy or have psychopathic traits, but that isn't always the case. Someone can suffer from this compulsion or this desire or this pleasure of having other people suffer at their own hands, or just watching other people suffer at other people's hands, and they get pleasure from it. But if you also have the normal amount of empathy, then I should define empathy there, right? I should say that if the individual has the normal amount of care about other people's, safety or their emotions and how they feel about things, I guess is the way to say, then the person suffering from sadistic personality disorder will tend not to act on it. It's sort of like when I talk about not offending minor attracted people, right? For those individuals who are minor attracted and they care about other human beings, they have the opportunity really to take measures, engage in practices and activities to avoid harming children, right? So it's the same with sadism. And so I think they mean psychopathic sadist. And what they were saying was, look, in order to be a sadist, you have to have a huge amount of empathy. Okay, there's that word, empathy. And what they were saying was that because you need to understand how other people are feeling in order to harm them, right? You take pleasure in other people being harmed, and a lot of the harm that sadists and psychopathic sadists will, commit on other people is psychological, right? Is humiliation, is putting other people down, is intimidation, scaring other people. Of course, there's physical harm, which is has less to do with understanding what some other people are feeling and thinking. Because, when the common sadistic psychopath activity is actually online, because they can get away with a lot of anonymous harm on others without worrying about being retaliated against, right? And so when these individuals are harming people, it's a lot of comments, right? It's a lot of making fun of others or putting other people down, refuting other people's points, trolling others, pranking others, whatever. And the people responding don't typically say, hey, that hurt my feelings, right? If someone is being mean to someone, like someone replies to a comment on YouTube and says, oh my God, you're so stupid. I can't believe you said that. Let me, set the record straight of just how completely stupid you are. Well, the reply to that reply is not typically, ouch, that hurt my feelings. The typical reply is, go to hell, you're an idiot, whatever, right? So the contention here by this poster on Reddit is the individual has to be pretty good at knowing what is going on in other people's hearts and minds, because people aren't upfront about the psychological harm that they're going through. So they must have huge amounts of empathy. Now, without going into the weeds on sadism and psychopathy and harm and being able to know what other people are feeling, because those things aren't necessarily correlated, I guess the argument is that if you were born or you were early on, you developed into a sadistic person, then you would have a greater interest in paying attention to how other people are feeling and thinking, so that you can know if you're harming or fine-tune the harming activities you engage in, right? And that could be true. I haven't looked at the research on that, but the correlation there of the ability to know what other people are thinking and feeling and being sadistic, I don't know if that's necessarily correlated. But this sparked a lively debate, so let's get into it. But first, let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. So first off, before going into the debate, let's look at our definitions, the 10 types that I laid out in the last episode of empathy. And let's take a guess as to which empathy this poster was referring to. So I have the 4 umbrella categories of caring, vicarious, listening, and understanding empathies. So let's look at caring empathies. Is that what they were thinking of? No. Was it vicarious empathies? Was that what they were referring to? Maybe. Was it listening empathies? No. Or maybe, but I don't think so. Understanding empathy. So it's probably an understanding empathy that the poster was referring to. And in this umbrella category, I have 2 different types. We have cognitive empathy and background empathy. Now, background empathy has to do with, one example is when I am listening to a client and they are, like I had a client one time who was telling me about, and he was actually a therapist himself, and he was talking about how he had yelled at this person at the beach because they had their boombox too loud. And some of you might be thinking, wait, you have beaches in Seattle? I thought Seattle was always raining all the time. And I would say, yes, we just bring our umbrellas. But anyway, so he was yelling at someone who had their boombox too loud. And the description of the story, he was being unreasonable. This was his version of the story. And I'm listening. I'm like, oof, that was a little hot-headed. And that was why he was coming to therapy. He was working on this. But he had seen it as this great success because he wasn't as bad as what he would have been otherwise without having worked on the things that we worked on. He came in saying, "Oh my God, Kirk, you'd be so proud of me that I succeeded. I did a good job." And I listened and I thought, oof, that was not a good, it was better, I suppose, than what you're telling me you're capable of, but that wasn't a good job. Not to say that you can't tell someone to turn down their boombox at a beach. I mean, that annoys the shit out of me as well. When people just think people walking around with their Bluetooth or their phones or something, their Bluetooth speakers, and thinking that everyone wants to hear it. It's like, what are you doing? Stop it. I had background empathy with him in that I knew his traumas from his childhood and had a compassionate, empathetic understanding of how he got to that, not only how he got to that place where he had that impulse to be very aggressive, but also the understanding, the empathy of how he thought he was succeeding and how he was looking to me for approval and praise. And so if I just looked at it as a discrete moment without taking his background into account, then I would have not had empathy and I would have thought, what are you talking about? That was awful. You were still very aggressive with that person. But I had background empathy, and so I thought about it differently, felt about it differently, and approached it differently. So that's background empathy. But that doesn't sound like what this poster on Reddit is talking about, where what they're saying is, sadists, psychopathic sadists, have a huge amount of empathy. That's not background empathy. Cognitive empathy, though, is probably what they're referring to. So this is defined as understanding another person's feelings and or where they're coming from, but more in this context of understanding other people's feelings, but not necessarily feeling their feelings or caring about their feelings, okay? So cognitive empathy is just understanding. Sometimes we might call this mentalization, or another term is reflective function. Peter Fonagy put that term forward. So it's essentially this idea and this function that humans are particularly good at, actually, that we have the ability to understand other people's minds. Theory of mind or metacognition, there's a lot of different other terms for this. But if we're looking at the empathy types, cognitive empathy is the best one. Now, you don't have to care about what other people are feeling to know what they're feeling, right? Some of you might have a politician in mind that you absolutely hate, and you might have an understanding of, or at least you think or have a guess as to what that individual is feeling or thinking, but you might not give a crap. You might even want them to suffer when you know that they might be suffering, So cognitive empathy doesn't necessarily mean that you have compassion or care. It also doesn't necessarily mean that you're vicariously feeling their feelings, which is another type of empathy. So cognitive empathy is what the poster on the psychology student subreddit was talking about, I think. But he didn't define it, right? But I think that's what he was referring to. Okay, so I'm going to read an excerpt from the most highest voted comment to this individual's post. And this person says, "I don't think it's accurate to claim that these individuals are truly empathetic people." Okay, there's that word, empathy. What's the definition? So I don't think it's accurate to claim that these individuals, these sadists, are truly empathetic people. It's more so like they have a scientific, explorational view towards empathy. Again, the word empathy. What's the definition? These psychopathic sadists, can manipulate expressions of empathy, what's the definition, to appear sympathetic and setting others at ease, but that does not mean they truly feel empathy. So there's so many usages of the word empathy without any definition. And I'm pretty sure this individual is using a different definition of empathy than the first person, although I can't know that because there's no definition. I recommend that whenever we use the word empathy, we actually clarify it by either telling people what type we're talking about or just use a descriptor, or don't even use the word empathy, right? But you can say, for example, like if the original poster had said that, in my opinion, sadists have a huge amount of cognitive empathy. Well, then we still wouldn't necessarily know if we fully understood what they were referring to, but we'd have a greater chance of understanding, right? Whereas if he said they must have a huge amount of compassionate empathy, or they must have sadists must have a huge amount of vicarious empathy or somatic empathy or something. Anyway, and if you want to, know all the different types that I've laid out, listen to my recent episode on the 10 types of empathy. Originally, I'd started out with like 7 or something, and then midway through that episode, I got up to like 12 or 11, and then I revised the list down to 10. And maybe in another month, it'll be a different number. But for now, it's 10. So this person is saying, I don't think it's accurate to claim that these individuals are truly empathetic people. Okay, so by context, let's try to guess at what type they're referring to. I don't think it's accurate to claim that these individuals are truly empathetic people. I think meaning I don't think that they have a lot of compassion and empathy, or I don't think they have a lot of sympathy for other people. Or it's also possible that what they're referring to is vicarious empathy. Now, I should also say that a lot of people, and I think maybe particularly clinicians, will meld a lot of these. I think that just anecdotally, if I heard someone using the word empathy, like in this context, I think they're referring to both caring and vicarious at the same time, as if those are related or the same or something. And they're not really, because you can have vicarious empathy. You can feel other people's feelings, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. You can also have a lot of caring empathy. You can care about other people once you have some awareness of how other people are feeling, sometimes through cognitive empathy, right? And you might not necessarily feel the other person's feelings. Those are very different experiences. Often we do have those at the same time, right? Or at least they will be in sequence, right? You will vicariously feel someone else's pain, and then you will care about their pain, or I should say, you vicariously feel the other person's pain, then you cognitively understand that they have pain, and then you care about that. All those are different types of empathy. Anyway, so they say, I don't think it's accurate to claim that sadistic people are truly empathetic people. It's more so like they have a scientific explorational view towards empathy. Again, I think the second use is just another way of saying cognitive empathy. Then they go on, they manipulate expressions of empathy. They can manipulate expressions of empathy. Okay, I think now what they're getting into is another misunderstanding, that sadists are what the internet will call a narcissist, but what they're referring to, I think, is a psychopath in the hare sense, H-A-R-E sense. I keep forgetting his first name, but I have one of his books behind me. Let me get it. Yeah, his name is Robert Hare, Dr. Robert Hare. His seminal book is Without Conscience, and it's about psychopaths. So I think what they're referring to in this comment is that psychopaths have an interest anyway in being able to understand what other people are thinking and feeling so that they can manipulate other people. So I think that's what they're referring to. And then they say, but that doesn't mean that they are truly feeling empathy. I think meaning that they don't necessarily, when they say feeling empathy, that makes me think that they're combining those vicarious and compassionate empathies together. So if that's what they're saying, then yes. But there's no definition. It's just a bunch of empathy words and no clarification, even necessarily by context. Now, I want to say I am not ridiculing anyone. I used to do this. Almost everybody that I know, in fact, maybe everyone that I know in the field does this. They just use the word empathy, and we're all supposed to understand what they mean, but that's a problem, right? All right, so as I said, that was the most upvoted comment on this post, and then someone replied to that comment saying, I liked this response the best because I found the original poster's argument compelling, but I felt like there was something missing, and this was it, meaning that they're saying, I thought that, yeah, maybe sadists do have a lot of empathy, but something felt off about it. So I'm really appreciating that you clarified what was wrong with the original poster's statement that sadists have empathy. All right, so then the next most upvoted comment is someone that says, that's theory of mind, not empathy. That's all they said. What they're saying is, it's not empathy that sadists have, it's theory of mind. And yeah, but it's also a type of empathy called cognitive empathy. But then the next, so someone actually commented on this comment, but it only got one upvote. So not a super popular reply to that reply, if that makes any sense. But someone says the following, or even cognitive. So, the first person said, that's theory of mind, not empathy. You're not talking about, people that are sadists, people who like to harm other people. They don't have empathy. They have theory of mind. And then someone says, or even cognitive empathy, which is understanding and perceiving empathy, even if you don't feel it emotionally as many of us do. So just chiming in here. I think from context, so it's great that someone has actually identified cognitive empathy. Yes, 2 thumbs up. Awesome. But then they say, which is understanding and perceiving empathy. Yeah, I would say understanding and perceiving feelings, because it's more specific. Even if you don't feel it emotionally as many of us do. So right there, I think what they're saying is you have cognitive empathy on one side, and then you have feeling empathy, which I think what they're talking about is vicarious empathy. And again, I want to emphasize that you can have vicarious empathy, meaning that you absorb and feel other people's feelings, and not necessarily care about other people's feelings. You might even hate the fact that you're feeling someone else's feelings, right? And also, you don't necessarily need to feel vicarious feelings that someone else is having in order to care, in order to have compassionate empathy or just sympathy, which I'm also having that as one of the types of empathy, because I think when people use empathy, they're more specifically referring to sympathy. Anyway, so there's that. But this is the best comment on this thread, I think, so far anyway, because it really gets at what I'm trying to get at, which is, look, there's different types of empathy. Okay, so then the next most upvoted comment to the original post is WTF. That's it. Just what the fuck. I think meaning that, oh my God, what are you talking about? Sadists have empathy? And there's so many problems with this because, like I said, having sadistic personality disorder does not mean that you want to act on it. It doesn't mean that you act on it. It just means you have this problem of taking pleasure in other people's harm. So there's that. But what I think everyone is thinking they're talking about is that you have people who take pleasure in other people's harm and actually try to harm others and cause a lot of harm in others, and they're just out to manipulate and just out to con people, and they don't care about other people's feelings at all. These people exist, but we would describe them as psychopathic sadists or acting out psychopathic sadists, because you can also have psychopathy and or sadism and attempt to modify and modulate your behavior and impulses such that you don't harm other people. I've treated people like this, and what is typically happening is that they have incurred consequences because of their actions, and or they just recognize that they have attachment needs and need to stop manipulating and harming others so that they can retain those attachments. And they seek out to understand how other people feel so that they can avoid harming others, so that they can avoid losing relationships or at least going to prison, because of their actions. Anyway, so this person is saying, what the fuck? Oh my God, there's something wrong with you. And I think there was something a little, there was a thread in the original poster's comment that was maybe trying to troll or trying to make psychopathic sadists look good in some way, like they're good people, like they're just, or I can't remember exactly, but so I don't know what the person is saying, what the fuck to, but anyway. The next person says, I think you mean identification, not empathy, LOL. So again, this word empathy, what do you mean? But they're saying identification. And yeah, the word, so one day if I have time, which I'm guessing I won't by the time I die because I have so many other things that are higher on the list, but I would love to do a deep dive on the concept of identification and all the psychodynamic concepts that are related to this, that overlap with it, like internalization or interject. I use these concepts, regardless of what term we put to it, I use these concepts all the time. It has to do with projective identification and internalization, interjecting. There's just so many, and there's so many different definitions. And I attempted at one point to actually write this up for my students, and I would give them a handout trying to lay out all this stuff. Like I eventually landed on this term, internalized relational representation. Anyway, what they're saying is, I think you mean identification. I think what they mean by identification. So that's another thing is like, if you use the word identification, my goodness, you have to clarify what you mean by that. But I think what they're saying is, I think you mean that they have the ability to insert themselves into other people's shoes, I'm guessing. Anyway, all right, let's take a break. We get back. Let's continue looking through this thread. All right, we're back from the break. So the next most upvoted comment is the following. I'm pretty sure empathy, this is good. So it looks like this person is going to define empathy. I'm pretty sure empathy is, but again, I'm pretty sure. And this is psychology students subreddit. This isn't just some a layperson subreddit. Now, everyone might be a layperson on this subreddit, but we can't really know. But anyway, this person says, I'm pretty sure empathy is the ability to feel feelings for others, not just understand what they are supposed to feel when you do something to someone else or how they would feel if someone else did something to you. All right, so let's look at the beginning of the sentence because I think that's the most important. I'm pretty sure empathy is the ability to feel feelings for others. Feel feelings for others. I think what this person is defining empathy, I think they're defining empathy as both vicarious empathy, feeling other people's feelings, often involuntarily, and also caring about other people's feelings. Now, you could argue that when you are open and you're caring about others, then you're more likely to feel other people's feelings. And we can get into that maybe, but I think it's important to delineate those two. But anyway, so I'm pretty sure empathy, so they're defining, I'm pretty sure empathy is defined as essentially the ability to feel feelings for others. Sounds like compassion. Not just understand what they are supposed to feel, not just, because this is another thing that I think they're So empathy is not just understand what they are supposed to feel when you do something to someone. So I think what they're saying is, the way you're defining empathy is not empathy, which is you're defining empathy as the ability to cognitively understand how you're supposed to feel when things are happening to people. But, we all understand that sadists or narcissists, as the internet will refer to, they don't have feelings, or they don't feel normal feelings, which is a whole nonsensical thing that I won't go into right now. But going on with this comment, but and I don't know, if I asked this original post or this commenter for clarification, maybe I'd be like, oh, okay, I'm on board with that. But going on, there's a cognitive component to empathy for sure, but it's mainly about affect or the emotions. All right, so right there, we have a problem, because they're saying, sure, there's a cognitive component to empathy, meaning an understanding of other people's feelings. But empathy is mainly about affect or the emotions. Affect meaning, often what people are saying, affect is like the display of emotion, or the emotions themselves, right? And so we could get into how we use the word affect versus emotion. There's so many things in this that have to be defined that I'm finding. When I was originally doing the episode on empathy, the original deep dive, I realized about halfway through, I'm like, oh my goodness, like every word that we're using, we use so many different ways. The word affect, the word emotion, the word feeling. What do we mean by that? And so everything has to be defined out. But anyway, so they're saying, sure, yeah, there's a little bit of a cognitive understanding component, but that's not really empathy. What empathy really is about the emotions. Again, just depends on what type of empathy we're talking about going on. It's not that without empathy, one cannot understand feelings. Okay, it's not that without empathy. So now I think what they're referring to is the phrase lack of empathy. So I guess I should go into that, right? What do we mean when we say lack of empathy? Have I gone over that? I don't think I have. So when we use the term or the phrase lack of empathy when we're referring to a psychopath, and not necessarily a sadist, right? Which I've already been over, but the key feature to antisocial and psychopathy is that they lack empathy. And what we're referring to is caring empathies. That's what we're referring to. We're not referring necessarily to vicarious or listening or understanding empathies. You can, for example, be a psychopath and not care about other people's feelings and yet have vicarious empathy. Now, they probably have less of that, and there is research on this, by the way, but it's not what we're referring to. What we're referring to is care, do you care about other people's feelings? Do you care that other people are suffering? Do you care that you're causing suffering in other people? That we're also not referring to the listening type of empathies, which I've gone over already, which have to do with behaviors, right? You can have, when you're engaging in a listening type of empathy, whether it's phenomenological empathy, rapport empathy, emotional availability empathy, or attunement empathy, when you're engaging in one of these types of empathy, you aren't necessarily vicariously feeling other people's feelings, and you're also not necessarily caring about other people's feelings. Typically it is because we care, but you can, for example, be a therapist, and it's at the end of the day, and you have a client that is being a jerk face to you, and you're burnt out, and you're not very caring. You're just at your wit's end about being compassionate towards maybe any client, but particularly this client. But you also know that you have a job to do, and so you engage in phenomenological empathy, rapport empathy, and you exhibit that you care. And that isn't a bad thing to do. It's a good thing to do. It's something that will affect outcomes in a positive way, typically. So you can have listening empathy without necessarily having caring empathy. Now, typically therapists have both listening and caring empathy, and also vicarious empathy. Anyway, and you can also have understanding empathy without having caring empathy. You can, and that's what they're talking about, is that for the sadist, they have understanding empathy, but they don't necessarily have listening, vicarious, or caring empathy. Okay, so getting back to the comment, they say, this is an excerpt, they physically don't feel badly for the other person. All right, so they physically don't feel badly. That points to vicarious and caring empathies being combined into one, which they often do coincide, but I think we have to delineate that, right? So I think what they're saying is psychopaths, people who lack empathy, they don't physically feel bad, right? When we have compassion, and I guess that is a question. Can you have compassionate empathy? Can you have sympathy? Can you have caring empathies while not physically feeling something, right? And a lot of our physical feelings are sub-awareness, right? We have a lot of emotion and a lot of care that we don't register fit in our conscious mind as something that's happening, but sometimes we do, right? And that, it's an interesting question. I'm sure there's a lot of research, but I think delineating that is important because you can care without, at the very least, noticing any kind of physical feeling, and you can also have a physical feeling without necessarily caring. All right, so reading another excerpt here. If they were empathizing with their victims, if the sadistic psychopath were empathizing with their victims, then they would feel horrible and scared like the victim as if he was doing it. End of quote there. They're genderizing the situation here, of course, but they're saying if they were empathizing with the victims, again, I think they're talking about caring, I think they're mashing in vicarious at the same time, then they would feel horrible and scared. Actually, it sounds like they're just talking about vicarious. Yeah. All right, another commenter here says, empathy is definitely a mixed bag and not synonymous with compassion. See Paul Bloom's work. End of comment. Okay, so let's break this down. Well, first off, Paul Bloom's work, from my memory, is to make the argument that empathy needs to be scrutinized, particularly when we're talking about the kind of empathy that we have in our society and about political ideas or movements. Like, if we look at the research, we tend to identify or feel other people's feelings or feel bad or feel compassion with people that we identify with, which are people that are culturally close to us, right? So if you have a Democrat and there's another Democrat, someone who is obviously a Democrat, maybe they state it as such, and they're suffering, then the first Democrat will care. Whereas if a Republican steps forward and says that they're suffering in the exact same way, even if it has nothing to do with politics, there's a chance that the first Democrat won't care about the Republican's feelings, even though it's just another human being experiencing a problem, So, and of course, when we broaden it out to the world stage, then we have an even bigger problem, right? When you have people in other countries, especially when they're considered to be further and further away from us culturally, right, wherever you are situated or how you think about yourself, then there's a greater chance that you won't care or feel the other person's feelings, right? And therefore, when we talk about empathy, we need to be careful because one way if we're just talking about the concepts of vicarious and caring empathies, then without being critical of without critiquing our empathetic reactions to other groups of people, then we might identify and we might have political policies that favor people that we, like if we're talking about certain wars that are happening in the world. I won't talk about particular, I did an episode not too long ago laying out a dozen or so wars, current conflicts that are happening around the world. And in a lot of these wars, there's a good chance that you and I will look at those wars and identify with one side or the other. Maybe not all of them, but many of them we would. And therefore, our position might be influenced by that, right? And it's hard to extract from that and to not evaluate that. Then we might have voting practices or policies that are unfair when you zoom out. And how do we gauge what's fair? Anyway. So that's a meandering way of describing what my memory is of Paul Bloom's work. But anyway, the original comment here, empathy is definitely a mixed bag and not synonymous with compassion. So again, what empathy are you talking about? I think what you're talking about is cognitive and vicarious empathy, I think. But anyway, they just say empathy is definitely a mixed bag. Okay, and empathy is not synonymous with compassion. Well, it is if we're using the type of empathy called compassionate empathy. It is I mean, I don't know if it's synonymous with compassion, but it's pretty close, actually. So let's look at the definition of compassion and empathy that I wrote down here. So it involves both an emotional and motivational component. You feel a sense of concern or distress for someone, and you're moved to help them. So that's pretty. I'm guessing that's pretty close to the word compassion. All right, so this is interesting. This is a commenter that they say they for sure have cognitive empathy. So that's all that they say, meaning, hey, yeah, sadists, psychopathic sadists who are manipulating others, they for sure have cognitive empathy, meaning the ability to understand what other people are feeling. Okay, this next comment is a surprise. It refers to me. I did not expect that to happen. That wasn't there when I saw this last week. And should I even include that? Fuck it. Okay. So this person says, for any fellow nerds in clinical psychology, and then they include a link to my deep dive on empathy. And they say, Dr. Kirk just uploaded this recently, a pretty great educational insight into the complexities of empathy. A part 2 exists too. Yeah, and there's also a part 3, and now I'm recording part 4. But, sometimes I am made aware that I don't know what famous exactly means, but so how do I word this? I cognitively, intellectually understand that I'm on the internet and I have a certain amount of notoriety or something, especially among psychology people, right? But when I see it, and people will reach out to me and they'll say, I really love your podcast and your YouTube channel. And that always makes me feel good. By the way, keep it coming because I have bad days. And don't feel like you have to. I'm just saying it's nice. And so that's what but it's different when you are on the internet and you see people talking about you, even though they don't expect you to see it, do you know? And you're thinking, and see, this got 3 upvotes. So that could just be like, oh, thanks for the link. But they could also be saying, oh yeah, I know that guy, or I've seen him on the internet before. I know it's just kind of a trip to think that I'm like whatever level of fame, like tiny amount, where someone just thought, oh, he just posted this episode on empathy. I guess it's another weird realization that like when I'm just sitting here in my office, actually I'm standing. I got a standing desk, y'all. And I'm really excited about it because posture and everything. But it's one thing to be standing here in my office and recording into a microphone. It just feels like it's not really going out into the world. But then when stuff like this happens, I'm thinking, oh, I'm in the world. I'm out there. I'm a part of the thing. I don't know how to describe it. All right, this next commenter says, sadism requires insight into emotions, which is not the same as empathy. All right, so just chiming in. Again, what type of empathy are you talking about? Sadism requires insight into emotions, i.e. cognitive empathy, which is not the same as empathy, i.e. compassion, empathy, or vicarious empathy. But then a little later in the same comment, they say, cognitive empathy is all you need to understand the situation, is basically what they're referring to. So they're saying, at one point, they're saying, sadism requires insight into emotions, which is not the same as empathy. But what they need is cognitive empathy. So I think what they're saying is, if we just use the word empathy without a clarifier, what we're referring to, I think is what they're referring to, is compassion empathy, maybe vicarious as well. And then the next sentence, they say, somatic empathy would be another layer, with or without perversion, to flip the valence of negative sentiment to positive for you. So I think what they're saying here by somatic empathy is what I'm referring to as vicarious empathies, because I have 2 types of vicarious empathies. I have emotional vicarious empathy, and then I have somatic empathy, or somatic vicarious empathy. Somatic empathy, it's a very rarely referred to type of empathy, and it was referred to more in the past, and it's also referred to more, I believe, in neuroscience, in that we as humans and other social creatures, social animals as well, will feel the feelings of other people as they're moving, right? When someone is walking, we have mirror neurons and other kinds of sympathetic nervous responses that have to do with feeling other people's movement and other people's physicality, right? So if someone's lifting something that's heavy, then we might have a physical feeling in our muscles or in our bones of the weight of that thing. We feel how heavy that might be. We don't just cognitively get it. We actually feel it in our bones, how heavy that thing is. And that's somatic empathy. That's not emotional empathy, right? You might also have emotional empathy, like, ooh, that must be really hard for them to pick that up. But that's a different experience. So it's a physical somatic. By them using somatic empathy, I think what they're referring to is emotional vicarious empathy. But I really appreciate that this person is actually even referring to these things. They're identifying cognitive empathy and somatic empathy, I think meaning vicarious empathy. But when they use the word empathy earlier in the comment without any clarifier, I think what they're referring to is compassionate and vicarious at the same time. All right, so I'm just scanning through more of the comments. There's actually some pretty interesting comments about the theory of sadism and emotion and development and trauma. I won't go into that right now. And this makes me want to do my deep dive on sadistic personality disorder, which is on my short list, which I'm guessing I will get to at some point. All right, so scanning more of the comments, here is another excerpt. Someone says, empathy is putting yourself in the other person's shoes. End of excerpt. So we're, I think, seeing another usage of the word empathy. And this one's interesting because you would think there would be one type of empathy that I could identify that is, quote unquote, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. But it's complicated. So the first category we want to look at is the listening type of empathies. And I actually just spent a lot of time going through my list of the 10 types to make it more clear. And as I often will do as I make episodes about a particular topic, it's doing all 4 of these episodes on empathy has really helped me to understand empathy a lot better. So when I look at listening empathies, I'm defining listening empathies as displaying that you're open and or caring, but it doesn't necessarily involve understanding empathy or vicarious empathy or caring empathy. So it is intentional, it's behavioral, it's displayed. And this has 4 different types. You have phenomenological, rapport, emotional availability, and attunement empathy. So which empathy is involved in putting yourself in someone else's shoes? Well, so there are 2 components to putting yourself in someone else, or what people refer to as putting yourself in someone else's shoes. One is the intention or the act of trying to be in someone else's shoes. The other component, I would argue, is actually being in someone else's shoes. And I think it's important to delineate that because in the clinical literature, we will use the word empathy in the Carl Rogers sense as an intention, not necessarily as a successful act. So when we have phenomenological empathy, which I'm defining as, it's not really my definition, it's just my wording of it, is entering into another person's world by listening in an open, non-judgmental, and curious manner while putting yourself aside. So you're entering, and I guess I might even add the word attempting to enter into another person's world. So that's phenomenological empathy. And I guess now that I think about it, does phenomenological empathy, does it necessitate that you've succeeded? And I would argue no, because that would lead to cognitive empathy or background empathy, right? Which we have a word for. And I think it's important to delineate that. Also, we have rapport empathy, which I'm defining as displaying care and understanding, often as a professional, to engender trust and connection with a client or a patient. So rapport empathy as with all the listening empathies, it might involve caring, but it might not. It might involve vicarious empathy, it might not. And it might involve understanding empathy, but it might not. So that's rapport empathy. And that's very similar to phenomenological empathy, but it's different. And then we have emotional availability empathy, which is being, I just changed my definition yet again. And I'm defining it as being present and open to someone's emotions and experiences. So emotional availability empathy, again, it's an intention, it's a display, it's a behavior. You can engage in a behavior in your mind. It can be like being open to someone, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you care or that it leads to care or understanding or vicarious. So it's emotional availability. And there's attunement empathy, which I'm delineating from emotional availability empathy, in that it's more comprehensive, in that you're paying attention and you're reacting in a caring or an appropriate way, in a way that's reflective of what someone else is feeling, So those are the different kinds of listening empathies, and they are all defined as intentions and as displays, as behaviors. They don't necessarily mean that you care, though. Probably you do, hopefully you do, but you might not. So when we say putting yourself in someone else's shoes, if we're talking about the act of trying to be in someone else's shoes, then we could be talking about phenomenological empathy. But I would argue that phenomenological empathy is much more involved and specific. It's much more the Carl Rogers, the phenomenology topic. I don't know how to talk today, but anyway. Or so there's that. But maybe, so putting yourself in someone else's shoes, is that rapport empathy? Not necessarily, right? Phenomenological empathy is much more related to putting yourself in someone, because it's attempting to enter into another person's world. Emotional availability empathy, no. Attunement empathy, maybe. But really, we're talking about phenomenological empathy. Now that I'm walking myself through this, when we're talking about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. But if we actually are in someone else's shoes, then we could be talking about either of the understanding empathies, whether it's cognitive or background empathy. And, it's pretty interesting. I hope this is interesting to y'all, because empathy is so important, and all 10 types of these empathies are so important, and so important for us to understand, not only as clinicians, of course, but as a society. So much depends on us having at least a conceptual understanding of these concepts. Now, we all have all of these empathies, right? We all engage in them, and we all experience them from other people, hopefully. And I think it's important to have words for it, because when we have words for it, I'll tell you, for myself as a clinician, when I go over these types of empathy, it puts it front of mind, so that when I'm talking to my clients, I'm much more conscious of how I am approaching and how I am displaying and also how I am processing what a client is telling me, right? If I just have that general amorphous definition of empathy, I might be feeling like or evaluating my approach to a client as being sufficiently empathetic, but I might be ignoring 3 major, umbrellas of empathy. I might have an evaluation of myself that I care, but I might not really understand, and I might not be exhibiting phenomenological empathy, which I find extremely important and helpful. I might not be open to the vicarious feelings that might be, being projected my way. It might be, I hate using the word projection in the wrong way. Well, maybe projection is the right word. Anyway, so I think this is extremely important. At the very least, for us clinicians, we definitely need a better language system around the topic of empathy, because it's so critical to understanding. I mean, empathy is just so critical to the relationship, which is so critical to positive outcomes in therapy. And we're all walking around using the word empathy as if we understand it, and as if we understand what other people mean by it, and as if we're communicating something specific when we're not. All right, just a couple more comments here. This person says, I don't think you understand what empathy means. You're confusing it with just saying able to perceive emotional reaction to others. Yeah. So they're saying, you don't know what empathy means. You think empathy means that it's so essentially what this person is saying, you don't understand what empathy means. You think empathy means cognitive empathy. So again, this person either doesn't understand the usage of empathy when it comes to cognitive empathy, or they think empathy is just the vicarious / caring empathy. So I'm not sure. And I guess it is kind of weird when I think about it. If you just understand, right? If you're a psychopathic con artist, sadist person, and you cognitively understand how someone else feels, and you can claim that that person has empathy or a type of empathy, they have cognitive empathy, when in the clinical literature we refer to these individuals as lacking empathy, then how do we reconcile that, right? Might we call cognitive empathy or background empathy something else? Should we call that empathy? But I don't think so, because I think at least for a good portion of cognitive and understanding empathy, it does lead to what we're generally, I don't know, as I walk myself through this, it's just so weird, right? It's like, so you can lack empathy, it's in the DSM, and yet you can have empathy as long as it's just the cognitive or the understanding types of empathy. It's weird, So, and I've never really liked the phrase lacks empathy. I think what they should be saying is the individual lacks compassion or care about other people's feelings. That's much more, I think, descriptive and specific. Okay, another comment here. This person says, you're confusing cognitive empathy with affective empathy. I want to point out that these individuals who are actually using these clarifiers for empathy are not upvoted very much. I don't know why, but I just want to point that out. So they're saying you're confusing cognitive empathy with affective empathy, affective, emotional empathy. So let's break this down. Cognitive empathy, I think they're by context using that term in the way that I would, but then they're saying affective empathy. I wonder what they mean by that. I think what they're doing is they're conflating the vicarious and caring empathies into one and calling that affective empathy. It's just a guess. All right, so that's the end of that episode. I should mention that the original post was a longer paragraph that's no longer available. I actually tried to find it in the Wayback Machine. I couldn't find it. But I should say that the original post was much more controversial in that, from my memory, the poster was saying was making an argument of like, hey, sadists and sadistic people have a lot of empathy. They have a lot of, positive elements, because in order to harm others, you have to care about what other people are going through. And I don't know, the way that a lot of people were reacting to this post was, oh my God, you are spreading some pretty dangerous information, or you come from a very dangerous or problematic viewpoint that is typically attributed to incels or edgelords or young people or so, I don't know. So there was a lot more to this post. There's a whole theme of that sort of thing. I don't know how to describe it. So I don't know why I feel like I should just mention that in case someone actually read this when it was originally posted. They're like, hey, you're not bringing up the fact that what this person was posting was actually highly problematic. I just thought I'd mention that. But anyway, so I thought I was done with the deep dive on empathy, but I thought it was interesting, and it gave me an opportunity to comb through this even for myself. As I said, as I was recording this episode, I would pause and go back over my notes and clean it up a bit. I like one of the definitions of empathy, I had the word empathy in it in the definition, which is a problem, right? So it gave me a chance to kind of, plus I visually organized everything better. I even defined the different umbrella types as well. So I feel a lot better about my notes. I felt good the last version, so maybe in the future I'll think, oh no, I really need to clean that up. But anyway, so I feel like this is really important for us to know and talk about and understand, especially for therapists and especially for professors and supervisors, because when we're talking with our trainees about empathy, it's really important that we delineate what we're talking about, because there's a chance that, just from my own experience, myself included, where you have trainers and supervisors that are saying, hey, you have to be empathetic, or here's how to be empathetic, and we're not defining it even in our own minds, and we're maybe communicating to someone that thinks about empathy in a completely different way, and they're walking away thinking that they understand what we're trying to get them to do, and they don't understand what we're trying to get them to do. So I think that's important. But anyway, all right, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself. Truly have empathy for yourself, whatever definition you want to use, because you deserve it. You really, really do.